They say war begins with a single shot, but in Sudan, it began with silence. The silence of promises never kept, of histories never healed, of voices buried beneath the weight of power. When the first bullet cracked through Khartoum's sky in 2023, it wasn't the start of something new, it was the echo of something ancient, the ghost of every betrayal, every broken deal, every dream that died waiting for justice. Two generals fighting for a throne made of ashes. Million ran not from one man or one army, but from the memories that made them. This is not just Sudan's story, it's ours. A reminder that when we fail to confront our past, it comes to us in the language of war. Hey, and welcome once again to the Sense of Self podcast, where we often look inward at who we are, what we carry, and how we heal. But sometimes understanding ourselves means looking outward because the world too has a memory. And in a recurring segment called When the Earth Remembers, we step beyond the self into the memories of nations, the roots of conflict, and the human cost of forgetting. From the war in Sudan to other corners of the world where history still breathes beneath the surface. These are not just stories of war, they are stories of us. Because nothing in our world just happens, the earth remembers how it began, and so will we. The morning war began in Khartoum. It was quiet at first, just the sound of distant gunfire, then the sky cracked open. Buildings trembled, people ran, clutching children, calling names that dissolved into chaos. And just like that, the capital of Sudan, a country that had seen too many wars, was at war with itself again. But this war, the one that began in April 2023, wasn't something new. It was merely the latest echo of an old argument, one that began long before the first shot was fired. But because the Sudan war didn't start yesterday, to really understand what's happening now, we have to travel far back to the day Sudan was born. Sudan was once Africa's largest country, a land of deserts and rivers, of Arabs and Africans, of Muslims and Christians and animists. But from the moment the British and the Egyptians caved it into a single colony in 1899, it was never truly one nation. It was two nations forced to share one flag. In the north, the Arabized elite was tied to Egypt and Islam. In the south, Africans, Christians, and traditional ruled from afar. The British deepened that divide. They governed the North and the South separately, encouraged different languages, different faith, and different futures. So when independence came in 1956, Sudan's first war was already waiting. A civil war between North and the South erupted before the ink on the Declaration of Independence was dry. And that first war would define everything that came after. In 1972, peace was signed, the Addis Ababa Agreement, but peace didn't last. When oil was discovered in the south, Khartoum wanted control. By 1983, the war began once again. That war lasted a period of 22 years. 2 million people died, and by the time it ended in 2005, the country was already exhausted. In 2011, the South finally broke away, becoming Southern Sudan. And for a brief moment, it seemed that the old wounds might finally heal. But the split didn't bring peace, it only revealed new fractures. The oil fields now lay mostly in southern Sudan, while the pipelines ran through the north. Money dried up. The old elites in Khartoum turned inwards, clinging to power as the economy collapsed. And behind the curtains of state politics, a new kind of power was rising. Men with guns and gold. Two men, Adel Fatan al-Bahan and Mohammed Hamadan Dagalo, better known as Hemedit. One a career soldier, the other one a camel trader turned warlord. Bahan came from the military establishment, loyal to the old Sudanese order. Hem came from Darfur, a man who rose from the ashes of genocide, commanding the Janjaweed militia during the war in Darfur in the early 2000s. The Janjaweed mounted Arab militia armed by the government were unleashed to crush a rebellion. Villages were burned. Over 300 people died. Millions were displaced. The world called it genocide. Hem called it survival. And as Sudan's president Omar al-Bashir faced mounting international pressure, he turned those militia into a paramilitary force, the Rapid Support Forces, better known as RSF, and he put him in charge. He gave him weapons, money, and a title, and in return, Hem gave him loyalty, or so it seemed. But in Sudan, loyalty is only as strong as the next coup. In 2019, after 3 decades of rule, Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. The streets of Khartoum were filled with chants of freedom, peace, and justice. It was the people, young people, old, men and women, who brought him down. They dreamed of a civilian democracy, but revolution don't end with dreams, they end with deals. And in those backroom deals, the people were betrayed once again. Bahan and Hem, once allies of Bashir, now cast themselves as protectors of the revolution. They formed a transitional council, a fragile marriage between civilians and generals. For a moment, Sudan stood on the edge of something new. Then, as always, power began to whisper. In October 2021, Bahan and Hem staged a coup again. They dissolved the civilian government, arrested ministers, and declared themselves guardians of order. Then people went back to the streets. The guardians or the generals went back to their guns. And the dream of democracy faded into tear gas and blood. Bahan led the army, that is the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SF. Hem commanded the RSF, a parallel military with tens of thousands of fighters and vast wealth from gold, mines, and foreign deals. The two men shared power uneasily, but the country couldn't serve two masters. In April 2023, plans were underway to merge the RSF into the National Army to finally put all guns under one command. Definitely Hem refused. He feared losing his autonomy, his fortune, his survival. Bahan pushed forward anyway, and so the two men who once stood side by side in coups turned their guns now on each other. On April 15th, 2023, war erupted again in Khartoum. Residents woke up to the roar of fighter jets, the rattle of machine guns, and the tastes of dust. But the people, as always, were the ones who paid. When cities fall, it doesn't always happen in a single moment. Sometimes it happens slowly. A shop closes, a bus route ends, a hospital runs out of medicine, and one day the city wakes up and realizes it's no longer alive. That's what happened to Khartoum. Once called the Bridge of Nile, Khartoum was a place of poets, thinkers, dreamers. Students debated politics in the tea stalls. The call to prayer floated over the river. The Nile divided the city into 3, Khartoum, Aduman, and Bahir. but the people crossed the bridge like blood flowing through one heart. When the war began, those bridges became front lines. The river that once joined the city is now divided. By mid 2023, Khartoum was in ruins. Government offices looted, hospitals destroyed, homes reduced to ashes. Satellite images showed a city scarred by bombs, craters, and smoke. A doctor at El Fasher Hospital said in tears to The Guardian that we are operating without anesthesia. We lose patients every hour. Sometimes we lose them in our hands. The world barely noticed. There were statements, condemnation, calls for restraint, but Sudan's suffering competed with louder tragedies. A journalist from Port Sudan said bitterly, "We are dying in silence. The world moved on before the bodies were even buried." As weeks turned into months, the war stopped being a fight for power and became a struggle for survival. The Sudanese armed forces, Burhan's men, controlled the skies and the eastern region. The RSF, Hemedti's forces, dominated the streets and the west. In Darfur, old nightmares returned. Mass graves appeared again in places whose name had already become synonymous with grief. Nyala, Jenaina, El Fasher. Communities had buried their dead in the 2000s, were digging again. The United Nations humanitarian coordinator warned that we are witnessing atrocities reminiscent of Darfur's darkest days. It wasn't just a war, it was a repetition, history looping back on itself. By early 2024, more than 10 million Sudanese had fled their homes. Some crossed into Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Others moved inside Sudan, surviving under trees, in abandoned schools, along dusty roads. Families carried what little they could: blankets, photographs, documents, and hope folded small in their hearts. In the camps near the border, children played with sticks shaped with like rifle. A mother told the media that they think it's a game, but one day they will learn the sound of real guns, and I fear what that will make of them. This is what war does. It teaches children new language, silence, hunger, and fear. Hem and Bahan, men of fires, both general presented themselves as patriots. Bahan claimed to defend the state, Hem claimed to defend the people, but in truth, both ruled over ruins. Bahan, a soldier from the River Nile north, carried the authority of the old Sudan, the military that had long considered itself guardian of the nation. Hem, a man from Darfur periphery, once dismissed as a nomad, embodied the resentment of the neglected regions. In his speech, Hem said, "We fight for a Sudan that belongs to all its people, not just those born near the Nile." To some, it sounded like revolution. To others, it was revenge wrapped in rhetoric. Meanwhile, Bahan told the crowd in Port Sudan, "We will not surrender this country to militia. Sudan will not fall." But the country had already fallen. Not to militia, but to history itself. Because when two men both claim to be saviors, it's often the people who need saving. The story of Sudan is not just Sudan's story. It's human story. It's what happened when the history isn't healed, when trauma becomes tradition. Every generation inherits not just land and language, but memory. And memory, if not faced, becomes destiny. We often talk about peace as if it's a treaty, a handshake, or a signed document. But peace is not built on paper. It's built in people. And how we choose to see one another, how we forgive, how we remember. Maybe the war in Sudan is asking us all a question. How many times can people be broken and still find the strength to rebuild? As of late 2025, the war continues. Bahan still commands the Port Sudan. Hem still holds Darfur or Darfur. Civilians flee. But even now, amid destruction, there are those who are still dreaming of rebuilding. A Sudanese teacher now living here in Nairobi said that we don't need heroes. We just need a chance to live. That line sticks because that is what every human being in every war really wants. Not glory, not revenge, just the simple right to live. And perhaps that's what the sense of self has always been about. Understanding the human beneath the noise, the story beneath the statics, the soul behind the struggle. So tonight, as you finish listening, just think of Sudan. Not as a headline, not as a tragedy, but as a mirror, showing us what happens when division outlives empathy, when history goes unhealed, when identity becomes a weapon instead of a home. The war in Sudan didn't start yesterday, and unless we learn from it, it won't end tomorrow. In the end, all wars are the same. All war are the same story told with different names. They begin with fear, they feed on pride, and they end with silence. But somewhere in that silence, a mother is whispering a prayer. A father is rebuilding a roof. A child writing their name on a piece of paper, dreaming of a future that doesn't yet exist. That is Sudan. That is resilience. That is what it means to be human. Maybe the real war isn't fought with guns. Maybe it's fought in memory, in the places we refuse to look, in the truths we bury deep enough to forget. Sudan reminds us that history doesn't vanish. It waits, and when we ignore it long enough, it returns wearing a different face, asking the same questions. Have we learned? If empathy is our last weapon, then remembering is our first act of resistance. Because somewhere, even now, someone is holding on to life quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. And that maybe is where peace begins. You've been listening to the Sense of Self podcast. I'm Kip Kaskei. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and above all, stay kind.